Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, Part 2. So, we last left off, we were talking about alignments, and in this edition, there were a lot of languages that you could have, that if you were not human, you would know a certain number of languages. Each race had their own language, and you would know the language not only of your own race, but of several others. And in addition to that, there was the common tongue, which everybody spoke, and there was, each alignment had its own language. So it's 9 different languages, plus there was a special language for thieves and a special language for druids. And so there was a lot of languages, and one of the abilities of assassins was to be able to learn the alignment language of another alignment besides their own. It helped with disguising. I think there were too many alignment languages, and so a house rule I came up with to handle that back in those days was there's only one lawful language that anybody who's a lawful alignment can speak and read and write if they're literate. If you're trying to learn it, learning to speak it and learning to read and write it are 2 different languages. It's a very complex language. There's also a neutral language, which is the secret language of druids. Only druids can read and write it, but anybody who's got a neutral alignment can learn that, can speak that. The evil language I combined with thieves' cant. So all thieves could read and write in the evil language, no matter what their alignment was, and all characters who were evil could speak the evil language. I also had a good language that all good characters could speak, but it was the secret language of rangers. Only rangers could read and write it. So, if you're a paladin, you're lawful good, so you would know both the lawful language and the good language. If you're a neutral good ranger, you would know the neutral language and the good language, and you'd be able to read and write the good language. Anyway, that was the little house rule that I used, but I don't use alignment languages anymore. So after that, it talks about player expenses. Gary Gygax gave out huge amounts of gold, and so he has various schemes to take the gold away from the characters. And then there's a couple of pages on random gems, how to roll up random gems. Armor types, and then it talks about hirelings. Now, if you're a low-level character, you're going to want to hire hirelings, and even high-level ones, you want to hire certain ones. Link Boy holds your lantern. Now, you want to put yourself in between your Link Boy and harm, because if you get a reputation for taking little boys off into dungeons and not bringing them back, nobody's going to want to be your Link Boy. So you have to be willing to lay down your life to protect the Link Boy. Bearers would carry your treasure back after you, because the mounts would be so big that you would need to hire people to help you carry it. You might need a teamster to drive the wagon. Also these other ones, including men-at-arms. If you're low level, you want some men-at-arms. If you're a fighter, you want a couple of guys to form the shield wall with you. If you're a magic user, you need a couple of bodyguards. There's also some expert ones like alchemists and armorers and sages. The DM didn't just tell you stuff. You needed to consult. If you needed to know something, you would hire a sage, and not every sage knew anything. So he tells you how to tell how much your sage knows and what does he know about. Because you might have to search around before you find a sage who knows something about that. Then it goes into henchmen. Henchmen were very important in these days. Your henchman is your future next character. But once you're 3rd level or higher, it's too dangerous to hire men-at-arms to go into the dungeon with you, or even Link Boy. So you'd get a henchman. He would get generally a half share of treasure. He'd get half a person's share of the treasure, and he would be of a particular class. So this is here. It shows you which ones they roll. And you'd roll, let's see, and you'd have to do stuff to attract the attention of potential henchmen, which costs money, and then you'd have to do things to try to persuade them to work for you, which costs money, and then you finally hire them, and the chances they're going to accept your employment are improved if your charisma's high. Okay, now, then it goes into spells. Now, with this edition, if you're a first level magic user, you would randomly roll your spells. You'd roll three rolls, one for offensive spells, one for defensive spells, and one for miscellaneous spells that are useful. And if it's a really dangerous dungeon, you might get an extra roll of the miscellaneous thing, but you didn't pick your starting spells. And I've had some new school players get really upset that they didn't get to pick their spells. They had to randomly roll them. I remember my most recent game I was a player in. The magic user pitched a big fit because the spells he rolled randomly were light, charm person, and summon, and he didn't think he had any good spells. I've also seen where somebody got mass charm and they thought it was a sucky spell. So the player quit at that point, and so I made that player an NPC that ran into my players. So it goes into more about the spells. It gives you some detail about how they work. And there's some nice little cartoons. Find Familiar was a spell you had to cast. It wasn't no business about you automatically getting a familiar. It was expensive to cast that spell, and you might not get it when you're starting out. After spells, it goes in a bit into traveling through the air on the back of a flying mount of some sort, aerial combat. And there's like these maneuverability class, which came up again in Spelljammer in 2nd edition. Waterborne adventures on a ship. Underwater adventures, which I didn't see much of that. Movement in the outdoors. Vision. Listening at doors, that's something. The different races had improved chances, but even if you're not a thief, you have a 10% chance to hear a noise at the door, and the DM would roll that, and if he says you don't hear anything, you don't know if you failed the roll or if there's nothing there to hear, because it happens behind the screen. Okay, then there's surprise, which surprise and initiative can be really complex in 1st edition, but if you follow all the rules, it works out really great. There's a thing that explains it clear in here called Addict, available on Dragon's Slit site, but in general, you roll for surprise, and if you get a 1 or 2, you're surprised. If you get a 3 or higher, you're not. Certain classes had advantages of that. Generally, a class, if they had an advantage to avoid being surprised, they could share that with their party. Psst, I hear something. But if they have an advantage against surprising others, they can't share that with the party. And usually those kind of advantages only work if they're alone. Elves have that, and rangers do too. Okay, now here's the reaction thing. You would add your charisma bonus to this. And this was not used enough. This makes a big deal because You don't have to fight every single goblin until they're all dead. When a certain amount of them are dead, they're going to run away in fright. But it goes on about turning undead. And more on combat. And then there's the non-lethal combat thing. Now, it's supposed to be that you take your armor class, it's a descending armor class, take that number, multiply it by 10, and that's your percentage chance to be hit in an unarmed roll. You roll a percent, and you can add these modifiers to it. And then you roll damage using these modifiers here, and you roll on this table. And I have this also for grappling and overbearing. But we didn't understand the rules that much, and usually we would just roll for damage, and so it made non-lethal combat more advantageous than rolling with a sword. Okay, now we get to the combat tables. Now, the fighter had the best, the fighter and cleric started off with the best combat ability. You're rolling against a descending armor class. And if you look, the 20s in the middle here repeat 5 times in a row. So some of these hard to hit armor classes, you still have a chance you could hit them before it starts getting hard again. That's one of the things I liked about first edition, is the really hard armor classes were easier to hit. And so, fighters and clerics had the best. Thieves and magic users were not quite as good. They were equal to a 0 level fighter. The fighters would improve 2 points every 2 levels. The clerics would improve 2 points every 3 levels. The thieves would improve 2 points every 4 levels. And the magic users would improve 2 points every 5 levels. So because of this, the clerics and fighters were pretty close to in combat ability until 5th level, when the fighters got to be better than clerics. The monsters had a roll to hit table that was more advantageous even than fighters until the fighters got to be 12th level. Now, a monster with the same hit dice as a fighter would have a slightly better chance to hit than the fighter. Now this is the assassinate table for assassins. You take the level of the assassin and the level of the victim. So if they're the same level, it's roughly a 50% chance your assassinate attempt will succeed. So at first level, 50%. If you're a first level assassin trying to assassinate somebody who's 10th or 11th level, it's a 1%. And if they're 12th level or higher, there's no chance it'll work. Another thing here is the turn undead. Now, I once played for several hours with some new school players in a dungeon filled with undead, and I was playing first edition, but they assumed that their first level cleric could only turn once. And I was assuming they could turn as many times a day as they want. And it took hours before we realized we didn't understand this. Also, I want to show you, somebody on Dragon's Foot came up with a improved chart for the roll to hit, where the steps, it improves by 1 in 1 increment. So fighters improves by 1 point every level. Also, I'm going to show you the wheel. The wheel here will tell you what your pluses or minus with a particular weapon are against a particular armor class. And if you look, it's got the repeating 20s on it. Alright, so next is psionics, which is kind of complex to run. And the saving throws for people who do not have psionics, this is them, and the worst things that can happen to you are more likely to happen to the magic users than it is to the stupid fighter. Now here's the saving throw matrix. The saving throws are based on 5 things. Paralyzation, poison, or death magic was invented for snakebite. Petrification or polymorph was for Medusa. Breath weapon was dragons, and rod, staff, or wand, and spells were for magic users. This is more than we need, but this is what we have, and so I'm used to it. One of the improvements of the later editions was to simplify this. But if the dragon breathes on you, all of your items have to make saving throws too. Items need to make saving throws. If the ogre punches your armor has to make a saving throw, or it might get broken. Here's the thing showing the repeating 20s. Okay, the section on insanity, and then there's experience. Monsters would have a certain number experience points that they would give you, plus there would be more per hit point for however many hit points they had. Plus there'd be a bonus if they had some sort of special ability or exceptional ability. But most of your experience points came from treasure. You didn't go into the dungeon to kill monsters. You went in there to get treasure and hope you don't have to fight the monsters to get it. Okay, so it goes into gaining experience. Back those days, you had to do training under somebody who's better than you in order to gain a level. It was the level that you're trying to get times 1,500 per week for 1 week for every level that you were trying to get. So that was another way that Gygax would take money from you. I didn't use this rule very much because I didn't give as big a treasure things as he did. So there's a thing on the campaign of the treasure, the inhabitants, forms of government, including magocracy, taxes. That was another way to get treasure away from the players. There's a sample dungeon that's partially keyed. There's an example of play, because some of the people who read this book had never played before. And there's a thing for randomly generating non-player characters and their little personality quirks. And their languages. And here's, if you want to hire somebody to cast spells for you, here's how much it costs. It's pretty expensive. It's cheaper to do it yourself, if you can. And there's things on building buildings and siege weapons to destroy those buildings, handing troublesome players. The ongoing campaign, and D&D was not the only game that TSR made. They also made Boot Hill and Gamma World. And here are some things for converting your character from Boot Hill to AD&D or Gamma World to AD&D. The games were very similar. In fact, back in these days, we thought that this and Gamma World were the same game. Here's a thing on making holy water, which is something that clerics do. Making magic items and scrolls. And then we come to the treasure. Now, if you randomly roll up treasure, if you look, armor and shields, swords, miscellaneous weapons. They begin at 61 and go through 100. So that means you have a 40% chance of having things that fighters are going to want out of the treasure hoard. Also, potions. Most potions fighters can use. So that's 60% chance of things that fighters can use. The remaining scrolls, rings, rods, miscellaneous magic, a lot of that stuff fighters could use of the miscellaneous magic. Some of the rings and some of the scrolls, but most of the wands they could not use. Magic users had a whole bunch of things that they could use, and clerics did too, in the miscellaneous magic section, but there were a lot that anybody could use, including fighters. Gygax once in his column explained that magic users already are powerful enough. You don't need to give them extra magic. So it goes into these different magic items, and then it explains what they are. There's quite a lot of them. But wanted to get to this. Artifacts and relics. They had artifacts and relics in here, and their powers were not spelled out. The DM would decide that for themselves. And there was like a list of powers here. One power from this, one power from that, one power from that. Some of them are malevolent effects. Some of them are superpowers, side effects. Okay, then we get to the appendices. There's a random dungeon generator, which makes for pretty good dungeons. And then it goes into random wilderness terrain. There's a generator for that. And then there are random monsters. Now, the player characters had levels. The spells had levels, and so did the dungeons. When this game was being created, the norm was not these little short module dungeons. It was mega dungeons with different levels. And the deeper levels were harder than the upper levels. And that's why the dwarf ability to detect sloping passages was very useful, because the DM would trick you into going to a deeper level by having a gently sloping passage which the dwarf could detect. So there were different levels of monsters. The first level monsters were things like dwarves and goblins and giant rats. And at every level, you might encounter a party of player characters. And then the highest level, level 10, had things like a beholder, a demon prince, an archdevil, 2 dragons, an iron golem, lich, an elder titan, a vampire with magic use. After that, there's underwater encounter table, deep water, underwater encounter table. There's astral and ethereal encounters here. Psionic encounters. Anytime you use one of these spells here, you might attract the attention of one of these psionic monsters. And if you are a psionicist, using your psionics might attract one of these guys. And this psionic monster thing includes major demons, demon princes, archdevils, intellect devourers, mind flayers. So if this were run like this, you would not want to have psionics, because you're just going to basically be lunch as soon as you use your powers. Okay, there's a thing on castles and who lives in the castle. Here's some encounter tables for different terrains: subarctic, temperate, lycanthropes, subtropical, Pleistocene, dinosaurs, freshwater, deep water, city-town ones, including different kinds of drunks. You run into a drunk, you might be an assassin, or a brigand, or a bandit, or a cleric, or a gentleman, an illusionist, a ruffian, a thief. You just never know who the drunk could be. And the notorious harlot table. including the cheap trollop and the typical streetwalker, and the sly pimp and the aged madam. And our famous picture of Emerald the Chaotic. It was a long time before I noticed the label. And then it goes into a random generator of creatures from the lower planes. It's a random demon generator here. And it has all the monsters that are in the monster manual. And it tells you the name of the monster, what size it is, what number the monster needs to hit armor class 0, the monster's armor class, the monster's hit dice, the number of attacks the monster gets, the special attacks it gets, the special defenses, how intelligent it is, and the experience point value of the monster. So you didn't have to look things up in the monster manual. It's right here for you. After that, it goes into gambling and traps and tricks and dungeon dressing. There's a random dungeon dressing thing here. Every time I look through this, I find stuff I didn't notice before. Some herbs and spices and their medicinal values, magical substances, conjured animals. There was a spell called Monster Summoning. It was started with a 3rd level spell, Monster Summoning 1, all the way up to a 9th level spell, Monster Summoning 7. Tells you the summoned monster. Here's the encumbrance thing. The encumbrance is measured in coins. 10 coins to a pound. It was how encumbrance was done back then. There's a thing on creating a party on the spur of the moment that's not 1st level and how to do that. This is for the DM to create a party of random adventurers that you meet in the dungeon and either team up with or fight. Some miscellaneous. There's a glossary of some of the terms in here, and an index. And then there's some of the things that are earlier in the book, so you don't have to look it up by page, but I never used that. So that is the second half of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide.